Time to dive into the dark, deep blue. Today's book is Deep Blue, a young adult fantasy novel that is part of the Waterfire Saga, written by author Jennifer Donnelly. I believe it's pronounced Donnelly. This is kind of one of those names where all the pronunciations sound somewhat the same, but are just different enough from in my experience, of course. The book was published on May 6th of 2014. It was okayly received as far as I could find. Most of the reviews I could find are more modern or not that far in the past, but the book actually has the accolade of winning the Green Earth Book Award in 2015. Unfortunately, beyond that, there's not too much to say about the book's background in general, so here's the report card. And let's move on with the review. We start where we always do. The cover. Now, the cover of this book is okay. I mean, it's good for what it is. It's nothing stellar. I'm not going to write home praises about it, but for the most part, I think it sells what the book's about well enough. You have what I assume is the main character front and center right here. Her name is Serafina. As she swims through the ocean, you get the very clear hint, oh, this is going to be a mermaid book. That's kind of her whole purpose being right there. In the background, you have mostly empty sea, with around on the bottom, you can see the burning remains of her former palace and city, which is underwater.
But at least it's warm around the fire.
Hey, if we're underwater, how could there be a...
On the back, you get a sort of synopsis. It does do something a little more interesting than normal, in that instead of giving you a flat synopsis of what the book's about, it basically gives you the prophecy stated within the book. It does kind of do that to an extent, but otherwise it's fine. This was probably written after the book had become a series, so they didn't really feel the need to explain it too much. But again, it works well for what it does. I do kind of wish some of the more overarching plot had made its way onto the cover, but it accomplishes what it sets out to do, and that's all I can ask of a book. So, we're going to move on to the synopsis. The synopsis of the book is fairly simple. A mermaid princess has to flee her city after her kingdom's enemy seize control of it, and she later finds out that she is the woman in a prophecy set to defeat a dark god that has been in prison for years. I don't know what you guys expected. It's a YA novel. I mean, that's about as generic as it comes. I'm sorry. With that being said, let's just dig into the review. And I'm going to start with this. For the general sense, I enjoyed reading this book. But in the way that you enjoy watching kind of a dumb action movie. It's there to entertain you. You munch on popcorn, have some fun doing it, but you kind of know that what you're watching is stupid, and there's a lot more that could have been done, and there was it's not something you're gonna go and be like, this was the best movie ever made. You're just like, oh no, that's a fun movie.
Damn right. I lost the rocket launcher. You lost? How do you lose a rocket launcher?
There were decent ideas within this book, and the story itself flowed well enough. I enjoyed many of the characters. Personally, Neela was my favorite, the main character's best friend, but I'm going to have to talk a little more on that later. And the book had just enough action and narrative intermixed with each other that you don't really get bored of one or the other. You don't get so bored you start falling asleep, but you also don't get so much energy running through that the book just gets tiring to read. Beyond those general praises, I'm going to have to be honest with you and admit that this book is rough. You can't really see her, she's behind Mountain Doom, but rough. So, let's start with the first thing. The first thing is that this book is labeled as a young adult book, but it feels more like it was written for children or maybe middle schoolers. And even then, it kind of feels like an insult to say this is a middle school book. It very much screams children book. But even then, it feels a little bit insulting because something like Percy Jackson is a children's novel, technically. And it's far more interesting than this, in that term. Far more well-written, to say. The plot itself is like super simple and the most generic YA fantasy kind of plot you can possibly think of. Which in itself is perfectly fine. But when you combine it with the uncreative world building, when you combine it with the plate mail levels of plot armor, and when you combine it with the somewhat shallow writing, get used to the puns, people. They aren't going away, and it's not my choice. But when you combine all those together, it just kind of adds up to a book that you kind of scratch your head and say, I mean, I had fun, but it's more of a guilty pleasure than anything. So let's go back into the components, skipping over the simple story, as anyone who's read YA novels knows exactly how generic the story is. And let's just go into the components one at a time. We'll start with the one I started with, the uncreative world building. Just put it simply, the world building in this book is not good at all. Ignoring the smaller nuanced things that I could complain about on a petty level, like how does a mermaid bleach their hair? Or how does a mermaid like blink back tears? Both of those kind of they're fine if you just read them, but then when you think about it, like if a mermaid puts bleach in their hair, wouldn't that kill the mermaid because they're in water? Or they should. Why would their eyes sting from tears and be forced to blink them back? Why would they even have tear ducts? Those are the small things that it's kind of like, okay, I'm being a little petty here. Okay, so let me go in, but there's the more general sense. Like, this is a book about mermaids. And half the time you will forget the book is set underwater. You literally have to be flat out reminded multiple times, oh yeah, we're underwater. Because the author doesn't really take advantage of the underwater setting to create a world. Sure, technology is different, and the characters are mermaids, and they interact with a lot of mermaid towns and cities, but everything functions the exact same way that it would function if it was just a regular human place. You can go into a blog, a paragraph, explaining how they harvested this special glass to harvest lava so they can stick it on a stick and carry it around, but when all it amounts to is it's just an underwater torch, functionally speaking, it's just an underwater torch. It really isn't worth that much description if the extent of it is it's a torch but underwater. Okay, and the sad thing is there are clear signs that there is some creative levels of world building in here. For example, one of the things Neela, as I mentioned before, she's an interesting design to imagine as a mermaid because she's described as more bioluminescent and fishy. You know, the kind of mermaids that would live deep down and have glowing things on them to help mark them out a little better. So that's a more interesting image to imagine than just the standard mermaid trope that I imagined every other character. And there's also the magical mirrors, which is kind of like a gateway to another dimension, and how people who own these mirrors have a specific spirit they often talk to on that other side who helps them get ready. And you can go into that dimension, but it's extremely dangerous for anyone who isn't already in there. And there's like those things are great, but then you have all the other stuff, the other aspects of world building that either don't make sense if you think about it, or just is our world but underwater. For example, mermaid society being separated from humans. The more you think about it, the less it makes sense. So mermaids are supposed to be hidden from humans, and they're so separated that they don't even call them humans anymore. They call them pteragogs. I think that's what it was. Pteragogs or pteragrogs. I think it's pteragog. But they know what a hockey stick is. And they know what modern technology is. And even when you think about it, it doesn't make sense how humans haven't figured out mermaids exist if it's in modern day. Because there's flat out entire mermaid towns in a river. And I don't know how many of you haven't seen a river, but they aren't that deep. Like, there are deep rivers, but when you compare it to the depth of the ocean and you can understand how, okay, I understand how mermaids could survive in the ocean and never be found. When you have mermaid societies in rivers, it just kind of loses it kind of stops making sense to me. Or this other thing, like how the lore of the world doesn't quite make sense. Like, okay, all mermaids are magical. We literally start the book with Seraphina, our main character, practicing spell song, a specific type of magic. But for some reason, the idea that there's a group of magical mermaids in a river somewhere it's just outlandish to many of these mermaids. It's a clearly fake. They can't possibly exist. And you're thinking, if you can practice magic, what makes this so absurd? It doesn't, like, I don't get it. I don't get why that would be absurd to them. It's not like the mythical, it doesn't talk about them like the, like, mythical heroes that people think just aren't real. It's the idea of magical river mermaids that seem out of question for them. So, let me tell you how this book does this. How do you think they take modern conventions and conventions and social constructs and bring them down into the underwater world? Do you think they, cleverly weave them in a way that we would understand, but it would also make sense for that society? No. You just give it a punny name. You need a crazy cat lady, but she's a mermaid, and obviously cats can't breathe underwater. So she's a crazy catfish lady. Or how Neela loves to eat underwater treats, a whole bunch of candies and stuff, but oh no. They don't have that kind of stuff underwater. You can't take a chocolate bar underwater and have it still taste good. You know what? She'll eat caramel algae. Need a language for dolphins? How about dolphin? Oh my god, I hate this. Want a family tree, but underwater. I guess it must be called a family coral. And okay. I'm not gonna lie to you guys on this one. I read this next one, and I closed the book, stood up, and stared out my window contemplating life for several minutes. Very heavily tempted to DNF the book based on this one thing alone. And, okay. So, you need a form of underwater money to give your mermaids. What do you call it? Wrong answer. You call it currency. I'm sorry. What? Like, I don't think this would have hit me as hard if they called it, like, shells. Like, something that simple. Like, oh, this will be 300 shells. That would make sense. Why would you call it currency? That's like me pulling out $1 and saying, here's my current land. What kind of sense does it make? So yeah, obviously, as I've proven, this book isn't very creative when it gets to its world building and doesn't really kind of mesh its world together very well. It kind of just takes our world and makes it underwater, but forgets to make it feel like it's underwater a lot of the time. So let's go into let's discuss the plot armor. When it comes to plot armor in books, it's a slippery slope. And plot armor is one of those things where people love to complain about it, but plot armor is an essential part of books. They claim that plot armor is bad for books. How, this plot armor ruins the book. And it's kind of like, yeah, every character has plot armor as the author decides. Anytime a character gets shot at and isn't immediately shot in the head and drops dead, that's considered plot armor, in a sense. Now, when people derogatorily say it has plot armor, that means that a character otherwise is surviving things that they shouldn't because the plot demands it. I.e., like, say a character gets in a car, turns it on, and the entire car explodes around them. And that's how the episode ends. And then the next episode suddenly reveals that he turned on the car, heard a click, and in that split second, dove out of the car, rolled into the nearby alley, sprinted 3 miles to get out of the explosion radius. That's plot armor. This book does a lot of that. Characters will often find themselves in situations so the author can introduce villains or introduce aspects of the world, but they don't have a good way to get out when the action catches up with them. Neela and Serafina are captured by the main bad guy so they can introduce the main bad guy. Oh, it just so happens a group of rogues break into the camp that day and free them. Oh, well, the villain is sending his forces after them and they're catching up. They have no way to outrun them. It sucks. Oh, but it just so happens they freed Serafina's magical teacher, who, despite being on the brink of near exhaustion, having been tortured, and having been captured earlier, somehow possesses enough magic to hold off an entire pursuing army. long enough for them to get away. And there's an old saying that goes, you're only allowed one coincidence to get your characters out of danger. After that, the audience begins to wise up and realize that you as the author are protecting your character, and a lot of the investment is being lost. They know there will be no real danger because you'll just write something to get them out of danger if that happens. So, with that said, let's move on to the next part, the shallow writing. Or let's more accurately say, shallow writing which leads to very hollow character moments. Deep Blue has a real bad habit of basically seeming to try to replicate the emotional moments it's seen elsewhere, but not putting in the work that made those moments in those works work. I gotta stop saying work. I gotta find a new way to say that. Impactful, maybe? Make those moments impactful. You know what? I'll cut this rant later. The moments that tug at your heartstring, good or bad, the moments that make you swell with emotions, it just tries to replicate them without putting in any of the effort to make it worth anything. For example, there's going to be some spoilers here, so quick warning. For example, Seraphina's father is killed in front of her. Yeah, that's sad on a character sense, but we barely knew the guy on a reader sense. I think we saw him once before this happened. So as a reader, you're sad that Seraphina is sad, but other than that, you don't feel anything else for her. Sure, all the girls that have gathered to come before this, River Witch Society, deciding that they're not going to go any further because Neela, whose nerves are getting the best of her, can't go further, decide that they're not going to go cross that final threshold without her, and were willing to meet the big bad guy's forces with her if she'll stay out here, is nice in concept, but it kind of falls apart when you realize that only Seraphina has known Neela enough to actually care about her. Two of them they met a week ago at most, and the other they met that day. So it makes no sense why they would say, okay, well, I'm going to die for you, this strange girl who I don't even think I introduced myself to. It's just kind of one of those, again, it makes sense with Seraphina doing it, but you kind of just scratch your head and think, why are all the other girls willing to meet their dooms standing alongside Neela, who has anxiety? I mean, if I was there, I mean, I'm not a girl, obviously, but if I was there, I'd probably just push her in because I don't want her to die, but I'm not going to die staying out here to make a point. It also feels more like they're manipulating Neela in this moment rather than standing with her. Oh, hey, you know what? I get that you don't have the courage to go in yet, but if you don't, I guess we're all gonna die. Because like I said, only Seraphina knows her well enough for that to make sense. There's also another small complaint I have. This one's admittedly much more petty, but it really feels like our main character does not listen. Like, she is told something, will think about it, and then like a chapter or two later, she goes back to assuming what she had before she was told this one thing. Like, she was flat out told, hey, humans are helping this evil mer kingdom that took over your kingdom. And then 3 chapters later, she's like, oh my god, humans are helping the evil mer kingdom that took over my kingdom. And it's just like, that's what you were just told. Why is it shocking? Oh, or, hey, I believe this one kingdom my kingdom has had issues with for a long time is responsible for this. Another character. No, they aren't. They just want you to think that. Another character. Oh, yeah, no, they're framing that kingdom. Another character. Yeah, it wasn't that kingdom that did that. Late chapters. Meets a girl from that kingdom that she thinks is responsible. It was your kingdom that did it. My kingdom didn't attack you. We're being framed. And it's just like, does she listen to anyone? Like, they have actual points. They have legitimate arguments, and she just seems to forget them after she leaves them. And it doesn't make sense to me. It's like, it's clearly there just to build tension, but it's false tension. You're just manufacturing tension for no reason. And okay, this last one isn't a complaint so much as it is a observation. But I think this book kind of queerbaits. The author very much makes it seem like Neela and Seraphina have feelings for each other, even though I'm 90% sure this book series is going to end with both of them in heteronormative relationships. And I really tried to tell myself I was just digging too deep into it, that this was just supposed to be a really close friendship that the two separated that the two have had for years. That, I just came off the radio apocalypse, so I'm seeing sapphic undertones that aren't there as a sort of side effect of reading that book. But the more I read, the more I was like, there's no way this is an accident. The two are captured, chained up in the same tent. What's the first thing either of them do after the captors leave? Pull at their chains as they attempt to hold each other's hands, and when they can't do that, settle for just laying their tails across from each other to bask in each other's comfort. Okay, you know what? Maybe they're just friends. Yeah, okay, they're just friends. I can buy that. Neela's cousin kind of cheats on... I say kind of. It is cheating in a sense, but it's a young adult novel, so it just means that her cousin Mahdi kissed some girl at a wave. God. And now Seraphina's upset. So Neela's cousin Mahdi did that. Neela proceeds to spend the entire time she interacts with Mahdi chewing him out for letting such a great catch like Seraphina get away. And okay, you know what? Best friends. She's going after someone who hurt her best friend. That makes sense. I get it. First thing Neela does upon arriving in the story, seek out Seraphina, bribe all of her guards to let her by, bribes the magic teacher, and then they both break out the window to go spend time together. Okay, again, good friend stuff. Good friend stuff, I get it. Seraphina saying, I will stay out here and die with you if you don't have the courage to step forward, because we're in this together. You know what? Again, that's good friend stuff. There's no... I'm reading too much. There's probably no sapphic undertones there. And then I read this. Oh, doesn't Sarah look gorgeous? Neela whispered. Merle's so hot she melts my face off, Yazid said. Wow, that's appropriate, Yaz. But it's her eyes that make her truly beautiful, Neela thought. They sparkled with intelligence and humor, darkened with doubt sometimes, shone in their depths with love, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. I'm sorry, girl. That's gay. Okay, again, maybe I'm reading too much into it. And this book is a young adult novel with White that was published in 2014. So I doubt it's going to end with either of these characters in a sapphic relationship with each other. I swear that was intentional. There's no way that was on accident. So yeah, all in all, I'd give this book a 5 out of 10. Unfortunately, this book is good in theory. There were good things in here. The story flowed well. And it was a fun read, but in the dumb, fun kind of sense. You can't look too deep past the surface, otherwise things start to fall apart. And there's some really dumb things. Seriously. Currency. You couldn't have thought of anything better? The plot armor is so thick, you stop feeling any form of tension and stop caring what's going to happen, because you know the author's just going to write them out of trouble. Its setting is heavily underutilized, and you only remember it's underwater when they directly reference the fact that, hey, we're underwater. Oh, hey, we're mermaids. In the end, it's a book that, while I enjoyed reading, doesn't really stand up very well on its own. I liked reading it, but again, more in the guilty pleasure kind of way. Which raises the question, does it deserve Mount Doom? Now, it's not great objectively, but I still had fun while reading it. And a book's purpose doesn't have to be anything more than just to entertain you. And it entertained me enough that I'm perfectly comfortable leaving it on my shelf and maybe returning to it one day, just to read it again and maybe see if my sapphic undertones disappear after not reading Radio Apocalypse for a while. I would recommend this book to anyone looking to read a book about magical mermaids, just with the fair caveat that you're not going to be taking into an underwater world. You're going to be reading about mermaids as they exist in our world. And if you are looking for a book that really utilizes an underwater setting, however, I would recommend Dark Life, another YA novel that I read last year. I put it on my top 5 books of 2022, and for good reason. So, with that being said, just remember, With every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having.